Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt's summer White House by Bill Bleyer, we learned the story of what happened after Edith's death and how Sagamore Hill became a National Historic Site. Now we're going to learn about its time as a National Historic Site since 1963 to present day. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 8, the final chapter, a National Historic Site. As soon as the federal government acquired Sagamore Hill, the National Park Service began making changes, a process that is still ongoing. Every project that has addressed either or both of two goals, to preserve the structures and grounds for the future and bring them closer to their appearance at the start of the 20th century to improve their interpretation for visitors. After the Theodore Roosevelt Association's donation of the Cove Neck property, the Park Service named Franklin Mullally as the first superintendent. By 2016, 10 more would follow. Mullally served only 6 months. In early 1964, the site became part of a New York City group without its own supervisor until Roy Beasley became superintendent of a once again independent Sagamore Hill on 1977. Not until 1965 did the Park Service begin work on the main house, which the agency began to call the Theodore Roosevelt home to distinguish it from the overall site. The initial project restored porches, window frames, and interior masonry. Bigger changes came the following year. The 4 exhibition rooms and other areas on the 3rd floor were restored to replicate their original appearance. Those changes were based largely on information from Archie and Ethel. Most of the furnishings were purchased for 4 servants' rooms, a schoolroom, Ted's bedroom, a trunk room, and a linens room because the original artifacts had been disposed of in 1953 when there were no plans to show the 3rd floor in its historic appearance. There were 2 other notable events in 1966. Ted's Old Orchard home was converted into the Old Orchard Museum, where items that would not have been in the house during the presidential years could be displayed and the family's history told. And Sagamore Hill was listed on the National Register of Historic Places on October 15th. The agency prepared a master plan for the new park in 1963, but never formally approved the document. It suggested restoration efforts such as removing a porch added to the new barn in the 1940s and returning the structure to its original appearance. The suggestion was never carried out. The barn continues to be used as a residence for employees. A subsequent general management plan that was approved calls for restoring the barn and using it as a new visitor center. The gray cottage had become vacant by 1950 and was renovated by the TRA in the 1950s as leased housing. It was rehabilitated again by the NPS in 1964 and since then has been used as a staff residence. In 1968, the Park Service reversed changes to the western side of the piazza, removing the rebuilt steps and railing installed by the TRA. The front hall was restored between 1978 and 1983. Significant alterations in the appearance of the house came in the 1980s. Historically appropriate wood shingles replaced the modern roof in 1984. A paint analysis the following year revealed that the original color scheme, thought to have been ochre and green, was gray. As a result, the house was repainted that color, shocking and dismaying many people who had only known the more colorful variation. Also in 1985, a 5-acre parcel located north of the new country access road and west of Sagamore Hill, land never owned by Theodore Roosevelt, was purchased by the Trust for Public Land. It was transferred to the Department of Interior, bringing the National Historic Site to its present 83 acres. The Roosevelt home, like most Queen Anne structures, has always been dark inside. Illuminating the interior for visitors was a problem since the house was opened to the public in 1953. The light fixtures in the first 4 decades of museum operation were so dim that visitors had a hard time making out what was in each room from the doorway. Guides sometimes used flashlights on cloudy days. Finally, in 1988, the MPS removed 30-year-old fixtures that were both anemic and so out of the character with the house that Jessica Kraft had derided them as disco lights. They were replaced by gas fixtures found in the attic and wired for electricity. The Park Service knew that some of the redecorating done before the house opened in 1953 was historically inaccurate. Bertha Rose's Roosevelt Memorial Association Furnishings Committee sometimes substituted its own judgment for family members' recollections or photographic evidence. For example, the committee decided to display all the family's heavy past chamber furniture in the master bedroom, even though there was ample documentation that the wardrobe had been in the nursery. These decisions were overturned after a historic furnishings report in 1990 precipitated the biggest changes in the house since it opened for visitors. The study was prepared by David Wallace, a curator with the Park Service's Historic Furnishings Division in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, who said, "I found documentation which indicated that some of the decisions made in the 1950s needed to be changed because of additional information like newly discovered photographs, letters from Mrs. Roosevelt to her family, and so on." In addition, his report noted that the association decided to display popular items such as safari trophies, even though they were not in the house during the presidential years 1901 to 1909, the period that was supposed to be reflected in the decoration. To rectify these inaccuracies, about 500 objects were relocated while the house was closed for 6 months in the beginning of 1993 to also allow a makeover of 5 second-floor rooms and reconstruction of decorating, plaster, and woodwork in 3 hallways. The changes included some that were obvious, such as banishing the large wardrobe from the master bedroom down the hall to its original location in the nursery, but few were likely to notice that the rhinoceros foot inkwell in the north room had traded places with the Lincoln bust inkwell in the library. Because some of the most beloved pieces dated from after TR's time as president, the Park Service decided to broaden the time period depicted in the house to include the post-presidential years, 1910 to 1919. The furnishings report pointed out that the first floor was decorated almost entirely with original pieces, with fewer Roosevelt artifacts on the upper floors. Based on the report, MPS purchased 225 objects from the proper time period and wove them into the furnishing scheme for the upper floors. Some replicas made by Sagamore Hill craftsmen included a canvas infant bathtub for the nursery were also added. The second floor is now 75% original, and the third floor is 35% original, higher than the percentages in the report, thanks to recent acquisitions, the curators note. After the furnishing study changes, visitors were allowed to see areas previously off-limits, such as the wainscoted splash closet next to the boys' room with its shower installed about 1907. At the same time, MPS abandoned the self-guiding tour system with plaques by the door and rangers available to answer questions. It shifted to guided tours to improve visitors' understanding and better protect the house and its artifacts. With guests no longer roaming without supervision, the agency removed the wooden gates blocking access to the rooms on the second and third floors and replaced them with less obtrusive velvet ropes. Another issue for park personnel in interpreting Sagamore Hill was that it was hard to tell that the property had been a working farm when Theodore Roosevelt lived there. While there were displays of farm implements and sheds, a windmill, and a few trees remaining from the orchard, the parking lot covered most of the gardens and some of the cultivated fields. Other once cultivated fields had been left to natural grasses. To make it easier to understand how the property was used initially, the Park Service in 2002 began to restore a portion of the 3.2-acre garden as part of a larger ongoing plan to return the house and grounds more closely to their original appearance. The restoration of the westernmost acre of the former gardens included recreating what has been its focal point, a rose arbor. To determine what should be incorporated in the restored place, the Park Service hired Richard Thomas of Soulscape Garden and Floral Design in Manhattan. He spent 3 months researching photographs and records, including a drawing of the garden made by Archie. We know from the records that Roosevelt loved gold roses, Thomas said. Roses, along with moonflowers and sweet autumn clematis, were planted on the 12-foot-high arbor after it was built in the spring of 2003. Thomas learned that the family planted a long list of annual and perennial flowers, including black-eyed Susans, asters, and lupine in the cutting garden, and these, along with berry bushes, were included in the restoration. All national park sites were supposed to operate under general management plans that rectify how they should run and their future needs. Since the draft plan for Sagamore Hill, created in the 1960s, was never adopted, in 2004 the MPS began work on a new document to remedy that omission. The planners looked at many critical issues. Should a new visitor center be created? Should the old Orchard Museum be expanded to incorporate storage for artifacts kept in the moldy basement of the old house? And most important, should the site more closely resemble its appearance during TR's lifetime? That last question raised controversial issues, such as should the parking lot be relocated away from the central core of the property, and should trees that had grown up to block the view of Oyster Bay Harbor that Roosevelt enjoyed be cut down. Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, you never know. On the one hand, it would be nice, but on the other hand, they'd have to plant a lot of new trees elsewhere. A year later, park officials answered those questions in a draft plan containing several options. The Sagamore staff supported the most ambitious and radical one. They called for removing the 90-space parking lot in the center of the property and building a new lot and visitor center on the northwest corner of the property down the hill, and out of sight from the main house. Trams or shuttle buses would take visitors up to the house. The goal of this alternative was to recreate as closely as possible the look of Cove Neck site when Roosevelt was president, following the example of many other presidential homes such as Mount Vernon, Monticello, and the Hermitage, which keep cars and other signs of the